A little bit about Patton. Few military figures in history have laid siege to the public imagination more relentlessly than George S. Patton Jr. Half a century after his exploits in North Africa, on Sicily, and across occupied Europe, his name still evokes the dash and brio of a cavalry charge. He is widely considered the best field commander in the American Army of World War II, and he is certainly one of the most feared by the Germans, who paid him the compliment before Normandy of massing defenses against a non-existent Army Patton group. By VE Day, in 1945, he commanded 18 divisions and 540,000 soldiers, a force comparable to the size of the American military at its peak in Vietnam. The New York Times declared in his obituary, "History has reached out and embraced General George Patton. His place is secure. He was not a man of peace." A man of peace he was not, but his legacy clearly transcends his military conquests. He was complex and contradictory, larger than life, and yet all too human. It is the Patton paradox that transfixes. And this is something that we've talked about before on this podcast, and it's something that I talk about all the time. And that is, people's strengths can be their weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And you get a guy like Patton who's hyper aggressive, and that actually ends up being a negative in some cases, even though it's extremely positive in others. Mm-hmm. Back to the book. A warlord fighting in the name of democracy. He was also an unrepentant aristocratic snob. So this is a guy that, and they talk about this some more, but a guy that was like proud of soldiers, almost to a fault. He revered soldiers, and yet he's an aristocrat. Mm. His devotion to common soldiers bordered on reverence, yet his slapping of 2 enlisted men nearly caused him to sit out the war in disgrace, and we'll get into that a little bit more. He exuded confidence and relentless certitude. In truth, he was insecure and often confused. He was well-read, fluent in French, and as a wealthy child of privilege and the husband of an heiress, at home in society's most fashionable salons, he could also be crude, rude, and plain foolish. His humility seemed heartfelt, yet he acknowledged an overdeveloped personal ambition, and once confessed, "I don't like the dirt at all, except as a means to fame." So, like I said, this guy is a complex guy. This isn't a salt of the earth David Hackworth guy that you never got that from him. You never got that from like a guy like Hackworth, that he had any sort of quest for glory. Yeah. He just a complete opposite. And that's why Patton for me is not a pure figure, you know? Not that I would really say that I can think of any pure figures, but he's definitely a very faulted leader, and which makes it good to learn from. And he had some amazing, I mean, obviously, here I am, a complete idiot loser sitting here calling, General George S. Patton saying he's a faulted leader. So don't get me wrong here. Yeah. The guy was unbelievably powerful leader, an incredible tactician and strategist. And it is very clear that he had some of those dichotomies that went a little bit too far in one way or the other. Mm-hmm. As a warrior, back to the book, as a warrior, his fundamental prescription for waging war involved violent attacks everywhere with everything. Yet he considered the carpet bombing of German cities to be barbaric, useless, and sadistic. So that's a contradiction you don't hear very much about him. And here's how he was seen by the higher-ups a little bit. Eisenhower, who once referred to Patton as this mentally unbalanced officer, also told George Marshall, "Patton is a problem child, but he is a great fighting leader in pursuit and exploitation." A division commander described the general as invaluable in war, but a disturbing element in times of peace. And to that, Patton was flattered. But perhaps the epitaph he would treasure most came from one of his soldiers before the Allied invasion of France. Here is a man for whom you would go to hell and back. So, clearly to his troops, they held him in very high regard. Quote from Patton, "May God have mercy on my enemies. They will need it." That's the kind of thing that when he says, people, the frontline troopers are going to hear that and say, yes, we are ready to roll. He also said, leadership is a thing that wins battles. I have it, but I'll be damned if I can define it. In Patton's career, we see certain trademarks: a relentless aggression and faith in the offensive, an uncanny instinct for enemy intentions and disposition. Common theme that we talk about all the time: being on offense, being aggressive. And Patton was an absolute, I think he is probably the most aggressive of the people that we've talked about, and of pretty much, I think, of anyone I've ever heard of. And it goes a little bit negative. And we see, too, the creeping arrogance, the hubris, which would cost the American army so dearly in Vietnam. Summing up the achievements of his troops in crushing the German counterattack of December 1944, Patton, with pardonable pride, claims to have moved farther and faster and engaged more divisions in less time than any other army in the history of the United States, possibly in the history of the world. No country can stand against such an army. This smug pride, the disease of victory, and I love that. That's a little something we should all remember. The disease of victory. Victory is supposed to be all positive, but guess what? There's something called the disease of victory. Back to the book. This disease of victory would rot the army from within, leading future commanders to underestimate their enemies and overestimate their own battlefield prowess. Tragically, the only antidote to this disease of victory would be the humiliation of defeat. We see that sometimes in sports.
A lot.
We see it in sports. We see it in business. Sometimes people need to get humbled.
Yeah.
And when they get humbled, they get arrogant from the victories, and then they get humbled and they get back in the game and they realize what they have to do to win. Mm-hmm. Back to the book. His passion for military life ran so deep that he considered it as natural for me to be a soldier as to breathe. War, he claimed, is the only place where a man really lives. Beyond a keen interest in technological developments of armored vehicles and airplanes, he retained a near fanatical belief in the importance of being mentally and physically ready to fight. Even in war-weary 1920s, he admonished junior officers, "You must school yourself to savagery." And speaking of savagery, this is the slaps, when he slapped these young enlisted troopers. The infamous slaps heard round the world. Patton's memoir gives the episode short shrift, but it nearly wrecked his life. In early August, while visiting wounded troops on Sicily, the commander cuffed a soldier who had been diagnosed as suffering from battle fatigue. Patton called it cowardice. Further examination revealed the man had malaria and dysentery. A week later, Patton repeated his behavior with another soldier, and this time made motions to draw his pistol, as if to shoot the wretch. Patton publicly apologized, but remained privately unrepentant. Had other officers had the courage to do likewise, he wrote, the shameful use of battle fatigue as an excuse for cowardice would have been infinitely reduced. So that was a significant incident that he publicly apologized, but he obviously didn't really mean that.
Right.
He felt he had done the right thing. But still, there was much glory to be won. Patton's exploit in the Battle of the Bulge, abruptly wheeling his army around and driving 100 miles through the icy Ardennes to hit the Germans in the flank with 17 divisions, remains among the most storied campaigns in modern warfare. And then after the war, as Europe was now almost an occupied state in many places, and as people talked about Patton being good for war but not being good for peace, and that turned out to be pretty accurate. No longer able to attack, he indeed became bullious. Patton was arrogant, defiant, and erratic as the summer of 1945 passed. And that's kind of the intro on Patton.